In my lifetime, I have harmed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, arsons. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. I don't believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole human race, including myself. This wasn't a suspect breaking under interrogation pressure. They came from Carl Panzram in 1928, sitting in a Washington, D.C. jail cell, writing his life story with complete honesty. No regret. No excuses. Just cold truth. When guards first heard him talking about his crimes, they dismissed it as attention-seeking nonsense. Prisoners fabricated stories all the time. But then investigators started checking his claims. Every location he mentioned, every date he provided, every detail he described, all of it checked out. Between 1920 and 1929, this man caused destruction across 3 continents. But here's what makes his story different. Carl Panzram didn't just confess. He explained everything. He documented it all. And what he revealed about how dangerous people are created will disturb you more than the crimes themselves. On June 28, 1891, in a farmhouse near East Grand Forks, Minnesota, Jan and Matilda Panzram welcomed their 6th child into the world. They named him Charles, though he would later prefer Carl. His parents, immigrants from East Prussia, ran their household with harsh discipline that bordered on cruelty. 7 children worked the fields from dawn to darkness, and when truancy laws forced them into school during the day, their parents made them work the fields at night. Carl later remembered getting only 2 hours of sleep before school. Punishments for any perceived failure included being chained up or deprived of food for days. There was no tenderness, no affection, only endless labor and brutal consequences for any sign of weakness. By age 5, Carl already saw himself as different from other children. He would later write that other children didn't like him, and he didn't like them either. He became a liar and a thief before he could properly tie his shoes, stealing small items from neighbors and classmates. But these were just the early warning signs of what was to come. When Carl was 7 years old, his father abandoned the family without warning, leaving Matilda to raise 7 children alone on a failing farm. Around this same time, Carl developed a serious infection in his skull that required surgery. The operation was performed at home, worsening the infection. When they finally took him to a hospital for proper medical care, the damage may have already been done. Doctors could never determine if the infection and botched surgery caused brain damage, but the timing was unmistakable. After the surgery, Carl's behavior became increasingly violent and uncontrollable. He would fly into rages at the slightest provocation, attacking other children and even adults who tried to discipline him. One by one, his older brothers left the farm, escaping the brutal conditions and leaving Carl behind. In 1905, his stepbrother Louis passed away while working as a lumberjack. Carl was now essentially alone with a mother who saw him as nothing but a burden and a source of free labor. In 1899, at just 8 years old, Carl was arrested for being intoxicated and disorderly. 4 years later, at 12, he was arrested again for being drunk and incorrigible. That same year, he committed his first major theft, stealing cake, apples, and a revolver from a neighbor's house. In October 1903, Matilda Panzram made a decision that would change her son forever. She sent 12-year-old Carl to the Minnesota State Training School, supposedly a reform school for troubled boys. What happened to Carl in that institution would destroy whatever humanity might have remained in him. The Minnesota State Training School was a house of horrors disguised as rehabilitation. Carl later wrote that staff members regularly beat and violated the children in a room they nicknamed the paint shop, because boys left that room painted with their own blood and bruises. The mistreatment was systematic, brutal, and constant. Carl's formal criminal education continued in 1906 when he was arrested for burglary in Butte, Montana. He was sentenced to 1 year at Montana State Reform School in Miles City. If the Minnesota training school had been terrible, Montana was worse. When a guard named Bouchard punished Carl for some minor infraction, Carl's response was swift and devastating. He grabbed a wooden board and beat the guard so severely that the man was critically injured. For this, Carl was thrown into solitary confinement. But he didn't care. He had proven to himself that he could harm others worse than they could harm him. In 1907, Carl and another inmate escaped from Montana State Reform School. What followed was a week-long crime spree across Montana that included robbery, burglary, and arson. Carl had a particular hatred for churches and burned down several during this spree. When asked later why he targeted churches, Carl said he hated everything that claimed to represent goodness or hope. While intoxicated in a Helena saloon, he enlisted in the United States Army. The military assigned him to the 6th Infantry at Fort William Henry Harrison. But Carl was a hopeless soldier. He refused to follow orders and stole supplies. The Army court-martialed Carl for stealing supplies worth $84.24, a significant sum in 1907. His sentence was served at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, from April 1908 to August 1910. Carl would later write that if he had been troubled before Leavenworth, the military prison destroyed any remaining shred of goodness in him. The guards were brutal, even by early 20th century military justice standards. Carl was beaten, starved, and subjected to punishments that would be considered inhumane today. But instead of breaking him, these experiences taught Carl new levels of cruelty. When Carl was finally released and dishonorably discharged in August 1910, he was 20 years old and had spent most of his life in institutions. After his release from Leavenworth, Carl began a criminal career that would span the next 18 years. His pattern was consistent: steal everything he could carry, harm anyone who got in his way, and disappear before authorities could catch him. He developed a methodical approach to crime, carefully planning his robberies and always having an escape route prepared. Between 1910 and 1920, Carl was arrested and imprisoned repeatedly across the American West and Southwest. He served time in California, Texas, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Connecticut, and New York. Each imprisonment was marked by violence against guards and escape attempts. But Carl was also learning. With each arrest and imprisonment, he refined his methods, learned new criminal techniques from other inmates, and became more sophisticated in his approach to evading capture. In 1915, while serving time at Oregon State Penitentiary under the alias Jeff Baldwin, Carl helped a fellow inmate named Otto Hooker escape from prison. During Hooker's flight, he ended the life of prison superintendent Harry Minto. Although Carl hadn't pulled the trigger, he had made it possible. The feeling of being connected to such an act excited him in ways that simple robbery never had. Carl escaped from Oregon State Penitentiary twice, the second time by sawing through the bars of his cell. By 1918, when he successfully evaded capture after his second Oregon escape, Carl had become one of America's most wanted fugitives. Using the alias John O'Leary, Carl traveled across the country and even overseas. But he was also becoming bored with simple theft and assault. His mind was turning toward darker possibilities. He worked on ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. Using the alias John O'Leary and various other false names, Carl traveled across the country and even overseas, always staying one step ahead of the law. He worked on merchant ships, sailed to Panama and Europe, and spent time in Peru working in copper mines. But wherever he went, Carl left a trail of theft, assault, and increasingly violence that went beyond robbery. He later wrote that he fantasized about poisoning city water supplies, sinking passenger ships, and starting wars between nations. These weren't idle daydreams. Carl was developing detailed plans for maximum destruction. He studied chemistry from prison library books, learned about explosives, and gathered knowledge about how to inflict the greatest amount of harm on the greatest number of people. But Carl also recognized that such grand schemes required resources and planning beyond his current capabilities. So he continued with what he knew: robbery, assault, and staying ahead of the authorities. The year 1920 marked Carl Panzram's transformation into a true serial criminal. After a successful jewelry store robbery in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Carl found himself with $1,500 in cash. But before he could begin his plans, Carl needed to settle an old score. He had never forgotten his brutal treatment at Fort Leavenworth, and he especially remembered the man whose signature had approved his sentence, William Howard Taft, who had been Secretary of War when Carl was court-martialed and was now a former U.S. president. On September 16, 1920, Carl burglarized Taft's mansion in New Haven, Connecticut. He stole jewelry and bonds, but the prize he really wanted was Taft's personal Colt M1911.45 caliber handgun. Carl later wrote that stealing from Taft gave him more satisfaction than all his previous crimes combined. It wasn't just theft, it was personal revenge. Using Taft's stolen money, Carl purchased a small sailing yacht called the Akista. The boat was about 40 feet long, perfect for coastal sailing, and most importantly, it gave Carl the mobility and privacy he needed for what he planned next. This boat would become his mobile crime platform for the next several years, a floating tomb where multiple victims would meet their end. Carl sailed the Akista to City Island in the Bronx, where he began hunting for victims among the sailors who frequented the waterfront bars. He would approach lone sailors in bars, offering them work on his yacht, or simply inviting them aboard for drinks. Once his victims were on the boat, Carl would get them intoxicated, assault them, use Taft's stolen pistol, and dispose of their bodies in Long Island Sound near Execution Rocks Light. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Execution Rocks Light had earned its name because of the dangerous rocks that had wrecked countless ships over the years. Carl knew that bodies disposed there would either be swept out to sea or smashed against the rocks beyond recognition. For 3 months from his base at City Island, Carl systematically harmed sailors. He later claimed to have taken 10 lives during this period, though only some of these crimes could be verified. What is certain is that several sailors disappeared after being seen with a man matching Carl's description, and their bodies were never found. Carl's yacht-based crime spree ended only by accident. During rough weather, the Akista ran aground and sank near Atlantic City, New Jersey. Carl's last 2 intended victims managed to escape during the chaos. After losing his boat, Carl was arrested in Stamford, Connecticut for burglary and possession of a loaded handgun. Upon his release in 1921, Carl traveled to Philadelphia, where he got into an armed confrontation with police. Facing a long prison sentence, he managed to make bail and immediately fled to Norfolk, Virginia, where he caught a ship to Portuguese Angola in southern Africa. What Carl did in Angola represents some of the most disturbing crimes in his entire history. Working as a foreman on an oil rig, Carl had access to isolated areas and vulnerable local populations. When he grew bored with the work, he burned down the oil rig out of spite. According to his own confession, Carl committed terrible crimes against an Angolan boy estimated to be 11 or 12 years old. Carl wrote that he hired 6 local men to take him crocodile hunting in a canoe. Once they were in the remote backwaters, Carl used a Luger pistol against all 6 men and fed their bodies to the crocodiles. When local authorities began investigating the disappearances, Carl was forced to flee through the rainforest to the Belgian Congo. Carl's return to the United States in 1922 marked the beginning of the most intensively documented period of his criminal career. In July 1922, in Salem, Massachusetts, Carl took the life of a young boy. Later that year, near New Haven, Connecticut, he harmed another child. In June 1923, he stole 2 yachts in quick succession. The second yacht belonged to the local police chief of New Rochelle, a choice that demonstrated Carl's growing contempt for law enforcement. Using the police chief's stolen yacht, Carl picked up a 15-year-old boy named George Wallison, promising him a job on the boat. On June 27, 1923, while sailing near Kingston, New York, Carl encountered a man who he believed was planning to rob him. Carl's response was immediate and fatal. George Wallison watched this happen. The next day, when they docked at Peekskill, Wallison finally saw his chance. While Carl was distracted, Wallison jumped overboard and swam to shore. He immediately reported both his own assault and the crime he had witnessed to police in Yonkers. For the first time in his criminal career, Carl faced charges that included not just robbery and assault, but something far more serious. A witness had survived, and the authorities finally had testimony that could put Carl away for life. Carl's response to his arrest revealed the cunning intelligence that had kept him free for so many years. He convinced his lawyer to accept ownership of a stolen boat in exchange for bail money, then immediately skipped bail. His freedom lasted only 2 months. On August 26, 1923, John O'Leary was arrested in Larchmont, New York after breaking into a train depot. Carl was sentenced to 5 years in prison, to be served first at Sing Sing Prison and later at Clinton Prison in Dannemora. Even in maximum security, Carl couldn't stop himself from attempting violence. He tried to escape from Clinton Prison and ended up with serious injuries, including a damaged spine and broken ankles. When he was discharged in July 1928, after serving nearly 5 years, Carl had come to a disturbing conclusion about his own nature. He wasn't going to stop. Carl's last month of freedom, August 1928, was a concentrated burst of the violence that had defined his entire adult life. On August 20th, he burglarized a dentist's home in Washington, D.C., but simple theft no longer satisfied him. During that same month, Carl harmed at least 3 more victims. In Salem, he took the life of a young boy. In Connecticut, he harmed another child. And in Philadelphia, he ended the life of 14-year-old Alexander Ushak, a newsboy who had the misfortune of encountering Carl near the Delaware River. When Carl was arrested on August 30th, 1928, he was no longer the cunning escapist who had evaded capture for so many years. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, and ready for whatever consequences his crimes would bring. For the first time in his criminal career, Carl gave the police his real name. During his interrogation, Carl confessed to multiple crimes with a level of detail that shocked even experienced detectives. When asked why he harmed children, Carl's response was chillingly honest. "I hate the human race, and I get satisfaction from harming people." Given his extensive criminal record and his confessions to 21 lives taken, Carl Panzram was sentenced to 25 years to life at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He was assigned inmate number 31,614. Coincidentally, nearly the same institution where his transformation into a criminal had begun 18 years earlier. Carl's warning to the warden was characteristically direct. "I'll harm the first man that bothers me." The prison authorities, recognizing that Carl was too dangerous for normal work assignments, placed him alone in the laundry room under the supervision of civilian foreman Robert Warnke. Warnke had a reputation for bullying and harassing prisoners. Despite repeated warnings from Carl, Warnke continued his aggressive behavior. On June 20th, 1929, Carl made good on his promise. Using an iron bar, he beat Robert Warnke, ending his life and crushing the man's skull completely. Carl's trial for Warnke's demise was swift. He was convicted and sentenced to passing by hanging. When offered the opportunity for appeals, Carl's response was typical. He refused all legal assistance and told anyone who tried to help him that he wished they all had one neck and that I had my hands on it. While on death row, Carl encountered the only person who had ever shown him genuine kindness. Prison guard Henry Lesser began giving Carl small amounts of money to buy cigarettes. This simple act of humanity so surprised Carl that when Lesser provided him with writing materials, Carl began documenting his entire criminal career. The result was a detailed autobiography that remains one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. Carl began his written confession with words that revealed the complete absence of remorse that had driven his crimes. In my lifetime, I have harmed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, acts of arson, and other crimes. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry. On September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram walked to the gallows at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant. As guards attempted to place the traditional black hood over his head, Carl spat in the executioner's face. When asked for any last words, Carl's response was perfectly in character. "Yes, hurry it up. I could harm a dozen men while you're wasting time." At 6:02 a.m., Carl Panzram was declared gone. He was 39 years old and had spent more than half his life in various prisons and reform schools. His passing ended a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades and multiple continents. Carl Panzram's story reminds us of the critical importance of recognizing and addressing violence before it escalates. If this case made you think about the nature of evil and redemption, share this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most notorious criminals. And remember, staying informed about these dark chapters helps us build a safer future. Together, we can learn from the past to protect the present.